There's lots to talk about. I want to go straight to my panel. Joining us from Los Angeles is Jenelle Riley. She is Deputy Awards and Features Editor at Variety. Also joining us from LA, Michael Tran. He is co-author of UCLA's Hollywood Diversity Report. With us here in Washington is Hoyt. She's a film critic for AARP.org, Espanol. And joining us from New York is Max Alvarez. He's a film historian, author, and instructor. Jenelle, why don't I start with you? Because there's a lot of talk about female directors again this year.
Yes.
Quite a drought. It was 2010, I guess, when Catherine Bigelow won for The Hurt Locker. What's the deal? Why aren't we seeing more women being nominated?
Well, frankly, it needs to start at the studio level. They need to give women good movies. They need to give them opportunities, which is not to say there weren't some. Deborah Granick directed Leave No Trace, which was one of the most highly reviewed movies of the year. And Marielle Heller shepherded Can You Ever Forgive Me, one of my personal favorite movies of the year. But if you look at the 8 nominated films, they're all directed by men. And, it all starts with them getting the jobs. And hopefully, this will urge people to reach out and maybe take a chance on a woman who might not have been given the opportunities to get the experience as their male counterparts.
Michael, let's talk about taking that chance, giving a chance. You've just come out with another diversity report. There's been a lot of talk about diversity in Hollywood. Where do we stand? What are your latest results?
That's true. The team that I'm a part of at the UCLA, we found that diversity is still very much an issue in Hollywood, both in film and in TV. In TV, we find more progress and more sustained progress than in film. And I agree with Jenelle's point that the problem of the lack of women directors starts at the production level. Some of the most egregious findings that we've seen in the past 6 years has been the lack of women in positions of authority, like in TV show creators and directors.
And Michael, you're talking about TV. It's improving more for minorities and women than film, I see in the findings. Why is it that TV's making some inroads? And as you say, they could go a long way further as well. Why are they doing more so than films, would you say?
Well, it has to do with the structure of the industry. People are calling it the golden age of TV right now because there's so much production and so many more outlets to view TV. We have streaming services, broadcast, and cable for TV to be watched in. So there's just a lot more opportunities. And with more opportunities, people are more likely to take a risk, or what they see as a risk, on minorities and women.
Max, let me ask you about this, because it seems like every year right before the Oscars, there's some buzz about the films, the stars, but there's always the talk about the controversies. Does it overshadow the awards in a sense?
It does, and it's not particularly new, because the first talk I ever gave was for the Smithsonian 21 years ago, and it was called The Politics of Oscar. And so Oscar, the Academy Awards, has always been a political type of environment. And even in the late 90s, I remember People magazine publishing an article complaining about the lack of racial diversity in the Oscar nominations. It does serve as something of a buzzkill as you get into the season, because then everything gets politicized. But it does seem that tensions run high the closer we get to air date.
And of course, the complaints every year, it's just too long. You hear this every year. We had an additional controversy this year with Kevin Hart. What do you make of the fact that they're not actually going to have a host this year?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch. That may actually boost the ratings a bit, because how do you run a ship without a captain? So it depends on how they're going to change the format of the show. It's all about ratings, and the ratings have been on the decline for quite a number of years. Some of it has to do with the fact that maybe not as many big blockbuster films are nominated, and the mass TV audience may not recognize some of the nominations. But without a host, without an anchor, a celebrity anchor, that's going to be a challenge to get a bigger audience for the Oscars, I think.
Jenelle,
are we sure there's not a host? Because the rumor is Whoopi Goldberg is actually the secret host.
Really? That's what you're hearing?
Yeah, well, we know she's presenting, and I guess there's some sort of conspiracy theory because she hasn't been on The View in some time. Also, apparently she doesn't fly, So people are saying, no, she's just taking time to drive out there. But a lot of people are saying maybe she's the secret host, and they just figured they would bypass any controversy by just surprising us on the day of,
Well,
which
do you
I
think
actually think would be great.
She hosted, as I recall, in the mid-90s.
She has, and she was great.
She was great.
She did a
However,
job.
it was a really long telecast. I think it was 4 hours, so they may have to talk to her about timing.
Jenelle, I know you probably won't like this, me quoting another magazine, so forgive me, but I noticed the Time magazine headline was something like "Oscars a mess." You know, outstanding achievement in popular film category. They floated that idea. Everyone objected to it. They were going to give some awards during the commercial breaks, and then, of course, a lot of the main film directors were like, "Look, these people are really key to these films. They need to be honored." Talk to me about all the stuff that went into this as they tried to streamline it and how each one got knocked down.
Well, I can't remember who said it, but I remember seeing some wise soul on Twitter who said maybe the person who produces the Oscars should actually like the Oscars, because it seems like they're trying to change everything. And if it's all about ratings, like, to some degree I understand. There was also a rumor that ABC was going to premiere a new show, the Scott Foley show. I believe it's called like Whiskey Foxtrot. Thank you.
Whiskey
Thank
Cavalier.
You, Whiskey Cavalier. And so that was the real reason they were trying to keep the time down. They wanted it to be like the Super Bowl where they can push their show afterwards. The idea of moving 4 categories to commercial breaks, they chose some of the most important categories. One of my favorite wins of the last couple of years was Roger Deakins on his 14th nomination, finally won cinematography. It was a huge event. Editing is actually a really exciting race this year because it often is a precursor to Best Picture, but neither Roma or there's one other Best Picture nominee that isn't nominated for editing. And so it's really exciting that Hank Corwin, who is won the BAFTA, he edited Vice, he's worked with Terrence Malick. Like, these are people that people within the industry love, and we want to see them give their acceptance speeches. Hank Corwin's BAFTA speech was probably my favorite speech of the night, aside from Olivia Colman. And it just feels like they're not running this by anyone. They're just coming out with these crazy ideas and not beta testing them, so to speak. And the reaction is pretty swift.
Yeah, Anne?
And what I find more surprising is that the president of the Academy, John Bailey, is a cinematographer. He's a DP, so it's incredible that he would have approved at some point this idea.
It is kind of wild. Let's talk about Roma, because I know you grew up in Mexico City. Yes. How did that, from somebody who watches films and then also somebody who grew up there, I want to get your take on that film on 2 separate levels, as someone who grew up in Mexico City, but also as someone who loves films.
It is exactly the kind of movie, the kind of slice of life that I could say is almost identical to my life. I was growing up in those years. The divorce of my parents took place at the same time. Everything seemed very familiar. So I know this has been enough for a lot of people in Mexico to feel that the movie is great because it brought them back to those times. It didn't mean anything to me in that sense. I mean, I think I could have watched a 70s documentary and would have felt the same thing. So I'm a bit puzzled about what exactly it is in that sense that people love so much about going back to those times. On the other hand, as a film critic, I see it's a great piece of craftsmanship. It's a masterpiece when you see the artistic input, the mastery which it was done. But I do believe that for the regular public, for the big public, it doesn't have that appeal, that emotional appeal, because I don't think any of the characters is well developed enough so that you can really, feel for them.
You're not surprised, I should say you're not the only one who's surprised at how well this film was done. You talked to the director, who was even puzzled by this himself, wasn't he?
Right. The first question I asked Alfonso Cuarón is, you seemed very surprised when you got that first Golden Lion in Venice. So why were you so surprised? And he himself said, well, this is a movie about a very specific time, in a very specific place in the world, about very specific family dynamics that are specific to our country and many others, but not where the movie started getting all these great reviews. So I just couldn't understand what was the appeal for people who were so far away from this very, very specific thing about Roma. So he said, I just had to believe it. There is a universal appeal somewhere there.
Well, you know, Jenelle, we heard Anne use the expression open wound. This film has created an open wound in Hollywood because there's been some backlash about it. I want to listen to what Steven Spielberg had to say, and then I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen.
Once you commit to a television format, you're a TV movie. You certainly, if it's a good show, deserve an Emmy, but not an Oscar.
So they shouldn't be nominated for an Oscar?
I don't believe that films that are just are given token qualifications in a couple of theaters for less than a week should qualify for the Academy Award nomination.
And I don't think he's in the minority. There's been a lot of kind of grousing about this, hasn't there?
Yeah, I actually kind of laugh at Netflix snobbery because I always think about these people who complain about how Netflix is destroying cinema, then go home and binge The Punisher. I'm pretty sure everybody has a Netflix account. We all love it. This movie was not made for Netflix. Alfonso Cuarón made it independently, and it was sold to Netflix or acquired by them. If Roma isn't a real film, quote unquote, I honestly don't know what is. It's a beautiful movie. The craftsmanship is excellent. It was so interesting. It is very specific, and I have to admit there were some things I had to look up too. But I think the reason it works is because it is so specific, but speaks to sort of these universal truths. And you know, far be it from me to disagree with Steven Spielberg, but times are changing, and it's getting more expensive and harder to go to movie theaters. And you know, I know a lot of people did seek Roma out on the big screen, but filmmakers want their movies seen, and a lot of times, you know, your best bet is going to be Netflix. And, you know, I think they've mounted a great campaign for the movie, and probably a lot of people who wouldn't have seen it have.
Well, the problem is that in the case of Roma, Netflix definitely did get behind the film, which was very encouraging. But the problem is they have these amazing titles that get buried. I mean, the Orson Welles film, The Other Side of the Wind, probably one of the most important releases of the last 45 years, they buried. There's the film Velvet Buzzsaw by the filmmaker who made
Nightcrawler.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Nightcrawler.
no, I love that
It's a
movie,
terrific film, but you have to really dig for it on Netflix to find it. And I think that's one of the problems, is that they sometimes could get more behind these really dynamic films and support them more theatrically.
Michael, I want to talk to you about this because from a diversity standpoint, I mean, I think this movie kind of checks off some boxes, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And that's something we see largely, to a larger extent, in digital platforms. What we've seen in the last 6 years is that in terms of cast diversity and directors, digital platforms definitely do better in terms of highlighting the experiences of women and people of color, and including women and people of color in the cast and crews.
I want to kind of throw this open to anybody who wants to take a stab at it. I just talked to a futurist recently who said that Google and GPS are making us a lot dumber. We don't have to remember things. But is Netflix, in a sense, making us more sophisticated? Because you know, people don't go to films and watch subtitles. They just don't. And this film has managed to do it. Netflix, as you said, Max, poured a lot into this. And there's been a lot of series. I mean, I think of Narcos, what is the show, Border Town, the Finnish film, all in subtitles. Suddenly I'm watching all of this stuff where I think American audiences just were not equipped to do that before. And I'm wondering, does this open up a whole new avenue for international filmmakers? And I'm thinking of Zhang Yimou from China and others. What's your take on that? Max, why don't you take a stab at that one?
Certainly. The world cinema market was pretty significant until we started seeing it tapering off around the 90s. Home entertainment made watching subtitled films less appealing. I agree with you that Netflix has definitely opened doors to international cinema, and if it can get people more conditioned to watching subtitled films, I think it's fantastic. We have seen periods in the United States in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s where foreign language films were an important draw in specialized cinemas, and anything to improve that will be welcome, because we don't want to see that important avenue of art disappear.
And I know you've heard this complaint. I'm sure you haven't. Jenelle, I'll get to you right after this, but there's been this complaint. Well, why did this end up as a nominee? Why didn't they just put it in the foreign film category? There's some people who've even complained about that. I mean, there's all kinds of complaining out in Hollywood.
Always.
But what's your take on that?
You can never please everybody in this kind of event. Well, I think it had its round. Roma had its round of showings in great film festivals all over the world. It started in Venice. So I think the reaction it had from people who really do know and love cinema and could really appreciate how hard it would be to make that tracking, for instance, in the last scene where Cleo saves the kids. Started, like voice of mouth, or just
word of mouth, yeah.
A word of mouth. It started, spreading, and it created such a wave of appreciation and applause that I think it was unavoidable. That people said, well, okay, this is a masterpiece, and you have a lot of very strong people, from the industry, not Steven Spielberg, but many of the people, of the big giants of the industry, saying this is a masterpiece. This is the best film of the year, and it started also making or getting prizes all over the world, like in Britain, in France, everywhere. So it would have been very hard to ignore, and it would have been, I think, a bad thing on the Academy if they didn't acknowledge. But as you say, but I don't know if this answers your question, because you say you could have just stayed on the foreign film category.
Janelle,
so I don't know.
Janelle, I want to ask you one more question about Netflix, and of course we're talking about the Academy Awards, so I don't want to belabor Netflix, but one of the things that I find interesting about Spielberg's complaint is I worked at USA Today back from 2000 to 2003, and Craigslist was nothing, and then suddenly Craigslist was everything, and all of a sudden your classifieds go away and papers are dying. Is there a concern in Hollywood that maybe Netflix is going to really start encroaching on this marketplace, and that's one of the concerns that they have?
I think that is the big concern that people have. What I will say is filmmakers who I know who have worked with Netflix love the experience. They don't have to worry about box office. They're given a lot of creative control. I recently interviewed Dan Gilroy for Velvet Buzzsaw, and he said he would work with Netflix again in a heartbeat. I mean, they, from what I understand, really trust the auteurs and step away, and then to not have to watch those box office numbers and worry that you're going to lose theaters week after week must be such a relief.
Michael, a writer from the Wall Street Journal, says a vote for a film is a vote for a cause. So I want to get your feeling on that. Do you agree with that? And what's the messaging behind Best Picture nominees?
I agree with that too. Film, they're entertainment, but they're not just entertainment. The stories that are told in film really affect what happens in society. And if nothing else, they affect, what kinds of films are made the next year. So I think the Academy members should really consider what they're voting for and what kind of films they'd like to see in the future.
And will that have an impact? Do you think, dramatic impact?
Dramatic impact in what way?
Down the road a piece. You're talking about diversity. We keep talking about this, but is that what it's going to have to take?
Diversity, I always think of as is just a precondition. When you include lots of diverse voices in the room, that's good. It doesn't necessarily make good films. What makes good films is having a diverse group of storytellers that are able to tell their stories. We were talking about Alfonso Cuarón, and it might open the door for more international films to be appreciated, or it might just people just might see him as an exception to the rule. But at least he's proving that it can be done.
Anne, you were going to say?
Well, Netflix has now an office in Mexico City, and it has promised that they're going to do at least 40 or 50 productions in Mexico. So I think in a way we have been looking at this not correctly, because we've been talking about diversity as a moral imperative. And what I'm seeing now is that the numbers are speaking by themselves. And the fact that Black Panther had such, such success, such wide appeal, that it was a box office success, proves that you can, and that these two things meet up at one point. The Black Panther spoke to something, to the Black community that was very important for them, that it had a very important social value for them. And at the same time, it made a lot of money. So I do think at one point the two things are going to run together. And more than talking about a moral imperative, the producers are going to see, well, there's also the economic imperative, because this is the kind of films that is attracting people and giving them something else than just pure entertainment.
Yeah, I saw one person.
Actually, I'd like to speak to that. Yeah, actually, over 6 years of doing the Hollywood Diversity Report, we not only track race and gender diversity, we also track its relationship to the box office. And when you're speaking in terms of ticket sales or Nielsen household ratings for TV or social media engagement, audiences have spoken very loudly and very consistently that the projects that they gravitate to the most are the ones that best reflect the diversity of the United States. So as Anne was saying, they definitely do align, and they have been aligning for years.
But the studios just don't want to take those kind of chances. I think, to your point, Michael, they kind of see it as an aberration.
Yeah, they treat the successes as exceptions rather than the rules. It goes to the very structure of Hollywood and how it's based around art, and it's a very risky venture. So people like to default to what they think has worked in the past, and this is usually where societal biases come out, unfortunately.
All right, we only have a couple minutes left. What do you want to be Best Picture, and what do you think will be Best Picture?
That I can answer.
Honestly, my favorite movies of the year weren't even nominated. My favorite movies were Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and a film called The Hate U Give. And since they're out of the race, I would love to see Black Panther or Black Klansman win. I'm a big fan of The Favorite. It would mean a lot to see something like Roma win. It is definitely down to Roma and Green Book. And I could not imagine two more divergent movies in some ways. And it's so hard. Right now I'm going with Green Book because it won the PGA Award, which is usually a good bellwether. It did not get a SAG Ensemble nom, which is interesting. But Roma, I remember thinking, we'll know if the passion is real, because you can't tell the voters who to vote for. They're going to vote for what they want. We'll know if it's real if either of the actresses get a nomination. And then they both did. And the actor branch is the biggest one in the Academy, so I think the love is real. Roma also won the BAFTA Best Film Award over The Favorite, which was sort of the hometown favorite, for lack of a better word. So I got to be honest, I change my mind every day. One day I'm sure it'll be Roma, the next day I'm sure it would be Green Book. It's so hard to say. In this minute, in this hour, I would say Green Book.
I would love to see Cold War take it for foreign language film. That's just me.
Okay.
Beautiful movie.
And Anne?
Well, I think this is definitely one of the hardest years to predict anything, because the rules have changed so much. In decades of doing this, this is the hardest one I've ever had. I will say, like Jeanette and Michael, that I do wish that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse could win in Best Animated Movie. There's something interesting about this in this category that shows how the Academy works. The most people that work for the Academy, that are members of the Academy, work for Disney. So it's very hard for a non-Disney film to win in this category. So probably, if the odds go as they have been before, it's going to be a Disney film, either The Incredibles 2 or Ralph Wrecks the Internet. But I do wish for many reasons, that it should be Spider-Man Spider-Verse.
Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We want to leave you with Best Picture nominee Bohemian Rhapsody. Thanks for being with us.
We are the champions. We are the champions. No time for losers, 'cause we are the champions.
You're a legend, Fred. We're all legends.